Every month here at Crafty Soup, I'm inspired by existing products in the world and I create my own. This time around, we're going to be working with painting and inking on black cardstock, and I will share tips and tricks as we go. So stay tuned for all of that. Hello, everyone. My name is Misty. I play with paper in artful ways, so let's dive in. All right, today is all about adding color on top of black paper. And if you don't know this, it is possible to go ahead and add color on top of black paper. I am specifically going to be using this Vicki Boutin 12x12 black foundations paper. I believe the 12x12 size is being discontinued. However, I think there's still some available out there on the market, and there are smaller sizes as well. So if you want to try this paper is really good for wet mediums as well as dry mediums, and we're going to be using both, so I'm going with this. If you're just inking, you could use cardstock, but I am going to be using these pots of watercolor paint, and this paper will hold up much better to the paint than other papers. So let's go ahead and start off with the stenciling, because you don't need special paper to do this one. It does blend a little smoother on Vicki Boutin, but you can use any cardstock. I'm going to recreate this little hexagon print. And I'm going to do this by taking this hexagon cardboard piece, which is a leftover piece from one of my husband's board games, and I'm going to use that as a guide to mask off a stencil. So I'm getting a pattern within a pattern. You can cut out a hexagon with a punch, or maybe on an electronic die cut machine or a regular die cut machine, or you can try and draw it out by hand. It'll work better if it is more, I want to say equilateral, but that applies to triangles. So if all your sides and angles are nice and even, this will work better, and you'll see that a little bit more towards the end of the project as I'm getting this paper fuller of these shapes. But don't let this stop you. You could also do this with circles or hearts or any ordinary shape that you want. It just won't nest together the same way that hexagons do. So don't let this shape stop you if this isn't going to work for you. Try a different shape and don't worry about nesting them. Just try and get them on your paper. All right, so the key to inking on top of black is using the right kind of ink, and that is going to be something that has pigment in it. This ink in particular is the Distress Oxide ink, which is totally easy to find. You probably might already have some in your stash. If not, try a white pigment ink or even possibly a metallic pigment ink. Any pigment ink from your stash should be able to work on top of black. So if you don't have the oxides, search your stash and see if you have something else. Hybrid inks often have some pigment quality to them, so if you have hybrid inks, that might work. I'd say test it on a little sample before you go to town on a whole sheet. Now, as you can see here, I have my stencil that I've created with using tape to mask off the shape on top of a striped stencil. In order to get these shapes to nest back together in an organized way, I could just do this randomly, but I was really trying to get these shapes evenly spaced apart. I cut myself a little jig out of a scrap piece of paper, and I'm going to apply some temporary adhesive to it to get it to stay in place. And I'm going to line those up along the edges of the previous shapes that I already stenciled, and you can kind of see that jig through the stencil. So I'm just going to line it up so I can't see that jig barely anymore, and then I am free to go ahead and ink. Just be careful not to ink off where your tape is masking off. Now here's the part where I ran into a little bit of trouble. When I'm just trying to line it up with two other shapes, it was fine. But when I tried to get it to line it up with three other shapes, I did run into a little bit of problem because my hex was not perfectly sized. So here you can see I'm trying to line it up with those jigs, but it didn't quite work. So I'm just going to leave those little jigs in place, and they're going to work as more masking so that I can get extra area covered with ink. And here you can see it kind of filled in the rest of that shape. The more even your shapes are, the more luck you will have. But like I said, try whatever shapes you have in your stash to get this interesting pattern on pattern inked style. All right, let's move on to something that's a little bit trickier to accomplish, but don't worry, I will walk you through it. The first step is to do some stamping and heat embossing on top of our black paper. I'm going to use butterflies. You use whatever you have on hand. The paper does matter very much for this one. You either want watercolor paper, or here I'm using the Vicky Bouton paper. Regular cardstock will soak up the water too fast for this to work. All right, step one is to do our heat embossing, and this is an important step. I'm going to heat emboss with black on my black paper so that those colors will pop a lot more and look more kind of like stained glass. So it's a really neat effect, but you can feel free to heat emboss with whatever color embossing powder you have. I just happen to like the black on black. All right, I've got all three of my butterflies lined up. I'm going to use my embossing ink here. I'm going to give it plenty of inking because while you can do this in like a stamp positioner to ink over it twice, I'm trying to just freehand this, make it go quicker, and I want to get plenty of ink coverage the first time around. I'm using a little Brutus Monroe sample pot of black heat embossing powder, which I got from an event. And I'm going to try and use up this little black pot. So far, I think I like it better than my current black embossing powder. It seems to be less staticky. Speaking of which, I did brush my paper with that static pouch, the anti-static pouch, before I started this whole process. However, it's not super important because I'm using black on black. It won't show up. Stray embossing powder won't show up too badly. All right, I did my whole sheet that way, and now we are ready to start watercoloring. So let's talk about paint. I happen to have these mica watercolor paints. These are called Twinkling H2Os. They are no longer on the market. You can find them on eBay. I will leave the name down below so you can kind of copy and paste if you want to find these. However, if you don't have these, there are other mica paints out there. Pink and Main makes some powdered watercolor mica paints that you can just add water to. You take the powder out and add water to the powder. You don't want to add water to the whole pot. I could go into more on that, but I won't. So I'll just leave it at that for now. There are also sprays that have mica in them that you could use straight out of the jar as watercolor inks. You can also buy a shimmery add-on ink to plop into existing watercolors. So there's lots of ways to go about this, but what's important about this technique is you want some of that mica because the mica is what's going to help show up on top of the black. Now, some micas are just clear, some micas are colored, so you're really going to have to experiment with what your mica is and if that will show up on black. So I did a swatch sample over on the left to show you what it looks like if I just paint this mica paint on there. So you're seeing the color and the shine at the same time. But when we go to painting our images, this is where the heat embossing comes in really importantly. Because that creates a little rim or a little lip, I am really going to add a flood of color into these spaces. You can see how little paint I used on this one butterfly, but the previous two I did had a lot of paint sitting in there. That rim is going to hold that paint in there. It's holding the color, it's holding the mica, and it's holding all that water. But the more creamy the paint is, the more you will have mica and pigment that is floating in that water. And when that water dries, you'll have more of that shiny, colorful goodness left over. So the lip on that embossing is going to hold all of that in there so it doesn't just spread and dribble out on you. And you really want to concentrate up these colors and really kind of float these colors in there. I am mixing the colors a little bit as I go. I think it's a little more successful if you mix the colors separately on another palette. However, these images are so small that I'm not going to stress out about it. I am just going to kind of add colors to these areas as I see fit, and there's no rhyme or reason to what I'm doing. I'm just trying to use different colors than I used on the previous butterflies so that I have a variety. And I'm going to continue to fill in all of these little puddles. I am trying to use up the paint that is left over on my paintbrush before I move on to another color, just as an economical thing to save paint. And here you can start seeing how these are gonna look as they start drying. So I'm back. I've gone through some more butterflies. I've gone through some more colors. I'm doing a little bit more color mixing here on these butterflies as I go. Now, some of these images have very tight details to them, meaning all those lines are close together. In that case, I'm just going to paint over the lines because heat embossing resists water. The paint won't stick to those lines. It will kind of roll off and sink into the valleys created by the lines. So I'm not going to worry about it. And if you do have a little bit of mica that does stick, you can just kind of wipe it off and then your lines will pop back out and be distinctive again. And having those black lines there really makes this look a lot like stained glass because of the tradition of using a black material in between each pane of a stained glass. You get this super shiny stained glass effect. And I tell you, the mica is way shinier in person than the camera is getting it. Now here I'm showing you the difference between the really concentrated color on my butterflies versus just a light painting on the left. So you do really want to concentrate those colors. I kind of equated it to the thickness of like melted butter when I was thinking how to describe that. So if that's kind of a thickness quality that you can wrap your head around, then that's kind of how thick you want your paints to be as you're painting these. And then I use the coordinating dies to cut these out. You can always fussy cut them. I specifically chose shapes that I could die cut. So that is what I ended up with at the end of this painting project. And these are really beautiful in the stained glass quality. So I hope you appreciated something about this video, and if you did, please drop me a line and let me know what you liked so I can bring you future videos with the goodness that you enjoy. Until I am back with you for more crafty videos, I hope you have an artful day.